Welcome, dear listener, to Edward's Sleep Mysteries. I'm Edward, and tonight there is no hurry, no noise, no demands. As you listen, you may already be lying down or simply resting your eyes. If you'd like, tell me where you usually listen from, a bedroom, a quiet living room, or somewhere else entirely. If these stories bring you peace, you're always welcome to subscribe. Now, let the outside world fade. Our story is waiting. Chapter 1. A town well acquainted with itself. There are towns in England which seem to have been fashioned not so much by the hand of man as by the settled accumulation of years, by the patient layering of habit upon custom and custom upon tradition, until the whole has acquired a character as distinct and unmistakable as that of any individual person. Marrowley was such a town. It stood in a gentle valley, neither so remote as to be forgotten by the world, nor so near to the great thoroughfares as to be troubled by the restless ambitions that quicken the pulse of larger places. Its streets were narrow but clean, its buildings modest but well kept, and its inhabitants possessed that particular quality of knowing themselves and one another with a thoroughness that was at once the town's greatest comfort and its most vigilant constraint. The church of St. Bartholomew occupied the highest ground, its grey tower visible from every quarter, a perpetual reminder of the town's proper order and the watchful eye of Providence. Around the church square clustered the houses of those families whose names appeared with regularity upon subscription lists, and whose opinions, whether sought or not, carried the weight of generations. Here lived the Whitcombes, the Ashtons, the Delameres, and others of similar standing, each household maintaining its dignity with that effortless grace which comes only from never having doubted one's right to possess it. Mrs. Eleanor Whitcombe was perhaps the most universally beloved of these established figures. She was a widow of some 15 years, her husband having been a solicitor of excellent reputation and moderate fortune. Her house, though not the largest upon the square, was known for its welcoming character, and scarcely a week passed without some charitable errand taking her into the less prosperous quarters of Marrowley. She was a woman of middle height and kindly aspect, with silver hair arranged with simple elegance, and a manner that put even the most timid visitors at their ease. Her smile, when bestowed, was not the calculated gesture of condescension, but the natural expression of a genuinely warm disposition. Yet even Mrs. Whitcombe, for all her goodness, moved within the invisible boundaries that governed Marrowley society, boundaries so familiar as to be nearly imperceptible to those who had never transgressed them. Descending from the square, one found the town's commercial heart, where tradespeople conducted their business with that mixture of pride and deference appropriate to their station. Here was Mr. Jameson's draper's shop, its windows perpetually adorned with displays of impeccable taste. Here too was the establishment of Mr. Fletcher, the grocer, whose scales were reputed never to have erred by so much as a single ounce in either direction. Among these respectable shopkeepers moved the figure of Mr. Stephen Harrowell, a man of considerable local importance, though his precise occupation remained somewhat nebulous to casual observation. He served upon various committees, subscribed generously to worthy causes, and was consulted upon matters requiring sound judgment and discretion. He was a tall man, perhaps 50 years of age, with a bearing that suggested both authority and accessibility. His face bore the lines of one accustomed to thoughtful deliberation, and his voice, when he spoke in public gatherings, carried just that degree of warmth and firmness which inspires confidence without giving offence. Mr. Harrowell had an admirable talent for being everywhere useful and nowhere intrusive. He could be found offering counsel to younger men uncertain of their prospects, mediating minor disputes before they ripened into lasting grievances, and ensuring that the town's various charitable subscriptions reached their intended recipients without unseemly publicity. He was, in the estimation of Marrowley, a gentleman of the old school, a man who understood the delicate machinery of social harmony and kept it running with invisible skill. Beyond the shops, Along the quieter lanes where the houses grew smaller and the gardens more practical than ornamental, lived those whose contributions to Marrowleigh's life were essential yet often unremarked. Miss Pauline Rook resided in one such dwelling, a narrow house that she kept with the same careful attention she brought to her profession as a seamstress. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, neither handsome nor plain, with that self-contained demeanour common to those who have learned to depend upon their own capabilities rather than the assistance of others. Her fingers possessed a remarkable dexterity, and her eye for proportion and detail had earned her the custom of many of the town's more prosperous families. Yet for all her skill and reliability, Miss Rook remained perpetually on the margins of Marrowleigh society, welcomed into fine houses only through the servants' entrance, praised for her work but seldom invited to remain once her professional services were no longer required. She accepted this position without complaint or apparent bitterness, conducting herself with a quiet dignity that was admirable, though perhaps too easily overlooked by those whose own circumstances rendered such dignity unremarkable. Among the young men of Marrowleigh who harboured ambitions of advancement, few were more attentive to the subtleties of social advancement than Mr. Leonard Price. He held a position as junior clerk in the offices of Messrs. Thornbury and Sons, a legal firm whose practice extended throughout the county, and he approached this employment with the earnest dedication of one who understands that professional success depends not merely upon competence, but upon the cultivation of proper connections and the avoidance of unfortunate associations. Mr. Price was not yet 30, with a thin face made anxious by the perpetual calculation of risks and opportunities. He dressed with scrupulous attention to current fashion, attended church with unfailing regularity, and spoke to his superiors with a deference that bordered upon the theatrical. Yet beneath this careful performance lay a genuine anxiety, the fear that one misstep, one ill-considered friendship, one moment of relaxed vigilance might cost him everything he'd worked to achieve. In remarkable contrast to Mr. Price's visible striving stood the figure of Mr. Nathaniel Cross, a bookkeeper employed by Mr. Fletcher the grocer. Mr. Cross was a spare, quiet man whose age might have been anywhere between 35 and 50, for his face bore that ageless quality common to those who live largely within their own thoughts. He moved through Marrowleigh with the near invisibility of one who had long ago concluded that he possessed neither the charm to attract attention nor the ambition to pursue it. He lodged in rooms above a watchmaker's shop, took his modest meals at regular hours, and spent his evenings reading by lamplight or taking solitary walks through the town's quieter streets. Yet those who dismissed Mr. Cross as unremarkable would have been surprised to discover the acuity of his observations. He had spent a lifetime watching others while remaining himself unwatched, and he understood with peculiar clarity how the machinery of social judgment operated, how reputations were constructed and demolished, how the powerful maintained their positions and the powerless accommodated themselves to exclusion. These then were some of the principal figures who inhabited Marrowleigh in the weeks preceding Christmas of the year 1853. They were neither heroes nor villains in the grand sense, but ordinary people living ordinary lives within a community whose ordinariness was, to them, the very foundation of security and meaning. They greeted one another in the streets with practised courtesy, attended the same church services, participated in the same charitable subscriptions, and moved through their days with the comfortable assumption that tomorrow would resemble today, and next year would resemble this one, in all essential particulars. Yet even in the most settled of communities, there exist currents beneath the placid surface, small disturbances that might seem insignificant to the casual observer, but which to those directly affected carry the weight of consequence. A word withheld here, a gesture of coolness there, the subtle rearrangement of social boundaries that occurs without announcement or explanation, these are the small earthquakes that can alter the landscape of a life without ever making sufficient noise to attract general notice. As December advanced and the season of goodwill approached, Marrowleigh prepared itself for Christmas with its customary mixture of genuine piety and social ritual. Shop windows were decorated with holly and ribbon, the church prepared for special services, and households made ready to receive visitors according to established patterns of obligation and affection. The air itself seemed to acquire a particular quality, a crispness that quickened the step and brightened the eye, as if the very atmosphere conspired to lift the spirits and soften the heart. It was into this scene of seasonal preparation that there entered, so gradually as to be at first almost imperceptible, a disturbance. Not a disturbance of the obvious sort, marked by raised voices or public confrontation, but rather the kind that expresses itself through absences and silences, through conversations that do not occur and invitations that fail to arrive. To understand how such a disturbance could ripple through Marrowley, one must first understand how thoroughly the town knew itself, how completely each person understood their place within its complicated structure, and how swiftly even the smallest deviation from established patterns could be detected by those whose social antennae had been refined by generations of practice. The story that follows is neither sensational nor dramatic in the manner that might satisfy those who seek entertainment in extremes of passion or violence. It is rather a quiet story about quiet people, a story in which the greatest crimes are those of omission rather than commission, and in which redemption, when it comes, arrives not with trumpet fanfare, but with the soft footfall of conscience awakening to its own failures. It is a story about how easily kindness can retreat behind propriety, how swiftly judgment can masquerade as wisdom, and how difficult it can be to distinguish the maintenance of proper standards from the practice of casual cruelty. But I anticipate myself. Let us return to the beginning of this tale, to Christmas Eve in Marrowley, when the first unmistakable signs of disturbance made themselves known to those with eyes to see. Chapter 2. Christmas Eve in proper order. Christmas Eve descended upon Marrowley with all the ceremonial precision that the town had cultivated over generations. The morning arrived crisp and clear, the sort of December day that seems designed by Providence specifically for the purpose of seasonal celebration. Frost had painted delicate patterns upon every window, and the smoke from 100 chimneys rose straight into the windless air, creating pillars of grey against the pale sky. The townspeople emerged from their dwellings wrapped in their warmest coats and most cheerful dispositions, greeting one another with that heightened cordiality which the approach of Christmas invariably inspires, even in those whose natural temperament does not tend toward effusiveness. The shops along the high street conducted their final business of the year with practised efficiency. Mr. Fletcher supervised the loading of hampers destined for the tables of his more prosperous customers, ensuring that each contained precisely the mixture of luxury and staple that befitted both the season and the recipient's station. At the draper's establishment, Mr. Jameson measured out lengths of ribbon for those who had delayed their gift-wrapping preparations until this last possible moment, maintaining throughout the morning an expression of patient forbearance that suggested he had long since resigned himself to the procrastinating tendencies of human nature. Mr. Stephen Harrowell appeared in the square shortly before noon, pausing to exchange seasonal greetings with Mrs. Whitcomb, who had just emerged from the grocer's shop, accompanied by her maidservant, both laden with parcels. The conversation between them was brief but warm, touching upon the arrangements for the evening service and the general satisfaction both felt regarding the town's charitable collections, which had exceeded expectations despite the modest means of many contributors. Mr. Harrowell spoke with that combination of authority and geniality which had made him so valued a figure in Marrowley society, his voice carrying just far enough to be overheard by others in the vicinity, without appearing to be deliberately projected for that purpose. As the afternoon advanced, an air of pleasant anticipation settled over the town. Households prepared for the evening's festivities with varying degrees of elaboration according to their circumstances, but all with the same fundamental spirit of observance. Windows glowed with lamplight as dusk approached earlier than usual, or so it seemed to those whose excitement had compressed the hours into something less than their ordinary duration. The church bells began their call to service at precisely the appointed hour, their clear tones carrying across the valley and drawing the inhabitants of Marrowley towards St. Bartholomew's with the steady pull of long-established routine. The congregation assembled with a sense of occasion, heightened by the decorations that adorned the ancient building. Garlands of evergreen had been arranged along the pews, their scent mingling with that of candle wax and the mustiness of old prayer books to create an aroma that was, for those present, inseparable from the meaning of Christmas itself. The more prosperous families occupied their customary positions near the front, while those of humbler station filled the pews toward the rear, this arrangement being so thoroughly accepted by all parties that it had long since ceased to be perceived as anything other than the natural order of things. It was during the gathering before the service, in those minutes when the assembled townspeople exchanged greetings and remarked upon the beauty of the decorations, that the first discordant note made itself heard, though in so subtle a manner that many present failed to register its occurrence. Miss Pauline Rooke had arrived punctually, as was her habit, and had taken a seat in a middle pew on the left side of the nave. She was dressed with her customary neatness, her bonnet perhaps slightly less fashionable than those worn by the ladies near the front, but perfectly respectable and appropriate to the occasion. Mrs. Caroline Ashton, a lady of considerable local standing and a regular patron of Miss Rooke's professional services, approached along the aisle accompanied by her married daughter. As they drew level with the pew where Miss Rooke sat, there occurred a moment of eye contact, that fraction of a second during which recognition passes between acquaintances and determines the character of their subsequent interaction. Mrs. Ashton's expression, which had been one of general seasonal benevolence, underwent a change so minute as to be almost imperceptible, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely detectable coolness in what had been warmth. She inclined her head in acknowledgment of Miss Rooke's presence, but the greeting that accompanied this gesture was mechanical rather than heartfelt, and she passed on without pausing for conversation. Miss Rooke, for her part, returned the greeting with equal formality, her face betraying nothing of whatever thoughts or feelings this encounter might have stirred. Yet to Mr. Nathaniel Cross, who had observed the exchange from his position several pews behind, the alteration in temperature was unmistakable. He had witnessed too many such moments not to recognise their significance, had felt too often the particular quality of polite dismissal not to identify it when directed toward another. The service itself proceeded without incident, the familiar hymns sung with seasonal enthusiasm, the rector's sermon touching upon themes of charity and goodwill with an earnestness that appeared to move several members of the congregation to visible emotion. When the final blessing had been pronounced, and the assembled townspeople began to file out into the cold night air, the atmosphere was one of general satisfaction and renewed fellowship. Yet here, again, to those observant enough to notice, small departures from an established pattern made themselves known. In previous years, Miss Rooke had been among a group of single ladies who customarily gathered briefly on the church steps to exchange seasonal wishes before dispersing to their separate dwellings. This year, however, the conversation of this group seemed to reform itself in such a manner as to exclude her, not through any obvious rejection, but through a series of small movements and redirected attentions that left her standing slightly apart from the others. After a moment's hesitation, during which her expression remained carefully neutral, she withdrew quietly and made her way alone down the path leading from the churchyard. Mrs. Whitcomb, emerging from the church surrounded by friends and acquaintances, all eager to claim a moment of her attention, caught sight of Miss Rooke's solitary departure. A slight frown creased her kindly features, a look of puzzlement rather than disapproval, as though she had witnessed something that did not accord with her understanding of how things ought to be. She made as if to call out, but the press of well-wishers around her prevented immediate action, and by the time she had extricated herself sufficiently to act upon her impulse, Miss Rooke had disappeared into the darkness beyond the churchyard gate. Mr. Harrowell, too, had observed this small drama, though his response to it differed markedly from that of Mrs. Whitcomb. He stood in conversation with Mr. Leonard Price and several other young men of the town, and when Price made some casual reference to the evening's gatherings, mentioning in passing a small supper party to which he had been invited, Harrowell interjected with the air of one offering gentle counsel born of superior wisdom. His words, though spoken quietly enough that their full content was not audible to all present, appeared to concern the propriety of various social arrangements, and he accompanied them with that particular expression of benevolent concern that suggests the speaker acts only from the highest motives of protecting others from awkwardness or embarrassment. The square began to empty as families made their way to their various destinations, some to private celebrations in their own homes, others to gatherings at the houses of friends or relations. Lamplight spilled from windows onto the frozen ground, creating pools of warmth in the surrounding darkness. The town, to all outward appearance, was settling into its Christmas Eve with the same harmonious contentment it had displayed for generations. Yet something had shifted, some barely perceptible alteration in the social fabric that a less observant community might not have detected, but which in Marrowley, where every thread of connection was known and its pattern familiar, could not long remain unnoticed. What had been extended was now withheld. Where warmth had been, coolness had taken its place, and though no voice had been raised in accusation, though no word of explicit condemnation had been spoken, the effect was unmistakable to those who understood the language of exclusion as it was practiced in polite society. Mr. Cross, walking slowly homeward through the quiet streets, reflected upon what he had witnessed with that particular clarity of understanding that comes to those who have themselves experienced the subtle machinery of social rejection. He knew, though he could not yet have explained how he knew, that something of consequence had occurred, that the disturbance he had sensed was not the product of imagination or oversensitivity, but a real and deliberate rearrangement of social boundaries. The question that occupied his thoughts as he climbed the stairs to his modest lodgings was not whether such a thing had happened, but why, and at whose instigation, and to what ultimate purpose. Christmas Eve in Marrowley had passed in proper order, as the chapter heading suggests, but propriety, as Mr. Cross understood better than most, could serve as a cover for many things, not all of them deserving of the respectability with which they clothed themselves. Chapter 3. Courtesies, Glances, and Gentle Avoidances. The days immediately following Christmas possess a peculiar character, suspended as they are between the solemnity of the season just observed and the anticipation of the new year yet to arrive. In Marrowley, this interval was traditionally devoted to a pleasant round of visiting, the exchanging of small gifts that had been held in reserve, and the continuation of that spirit of fellowship which the Christmas festival had awakened. It was a time when even the most reserved inhabitants felt licensed to call upon acquaintances they might otherwise greet only in passing, when doors stood metaphorically, if not literally open, and when the usual boundaries of social intercourse relaxed just sufficiently to permit a warmer current of human connection to flow through the community. Mrs. Whitcomb conducted her charitable rounds with particular attention during these days, for she understood that the season's good cheer often served to illuminate, by contrast, the situations of those for whom cheer was in short supply. On the morning of the 27th she made her way along Miller's Lane, where the houses grew progressively smaller, and the window boxes, though tended with equal care to those in more prosperous quarters, contained hardier and less ornamental varieties of plant. Her destination was the dwelling of Mrs. Agnes Porter, a widow of slender means whose late husband's service as a schoolmaster had left her with respectability but little else. The visit proceeded according to the established pattern of such calls, tea being taken in the modest parlour, while the two ladies discussed matters of mutual concern with that combination of frankness and discretion which lengthy acquaintance permits. Yet Mrs. Whitcomb, whose sensitivity to social atmospheres had been refined by decades of observation, detected something unusual in her hostess's manner. Mrs. Porter spoke with her customary courtesy, but there was a guardedness in her responses, a tendency to redirect certain conversational threads before they could reach their natural conclusion. When Mrs. Whitcomb mentioned in the casual manner of one making innocent conversation that she had noticed Miss Rook's absence from the small gathering that had been planned at Mrs. Delamere's house on Christmas afternoon, Mrs. Porter's reaction was immediately telling. Her teacup paused midway to her lips, her eyes flickered away from those of her visitor, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular inflection of one who wishes to acknowledge a subject while simultaneously declining to explore it fully. "I believe," said Mrs. Porter carefully, "that Miss Rook found herself otherwise engaged. One cannot always accommodate every invitation, particularly during the busy season." The words themselves were entirely ordinary, yet their delivery suggested volumes. Mrs. Whitcomb, whose understanding of human nature was both deep and charitable, recognised the signs of discomfort, of knowledge being deliberately withheld, not from malice but from uncertainty about what ought properly to be said. She did not press the matter, for she was wise enough to know that forced confidences rarely yield useful information, but the exchange left her with a heightened sense that something irregular had occurred, something that made even the kindly Mrs. Porter reluctant to speak freely. Elsewhere in the town, Mr. Leonard Price was experiencing anxieties of a different but related nature. He'd received an invitation to dine at the home of Mr. Harrowell on the evening of the 28th, an honour he had accepted with an enthusiasm bordering on eagerness. Such invitations were not extended casually, and Price understood that to be noticed favourably by a man of Harrowell's standing could materially advance his prospects. Yet the invitation had come with a subtle suggestion, delivered with Harrowell's characteristic blend of friendliness and authority, that certain social connections might be more advantageous than others for a young man hoping to rise in his profession. The suggestion had not named Miss Rook explicitly, but Price, whose antennae for social nuance were perpetually extended, had understood the reference perfectly. He found himself now in that uncomfortable position of one who wishes to maintain good relations with all parties, while suspecting that such universal amity may not be possible. Walking through the town square on the afternoon of the 27th, he encountered Miss Rook emerging from the stationer's shop where she had been purchasing supplies for her work. The meeting was unexpected, and for a fraction of a second, Price's face revealed his internal struggle, uncertainty and calculation fighting for supremacy with his natural inclination towards civility. In the end, civility won, but it was civility of a diminished sort. He raised his hat and offered a greeting, but whereas in earlier times he might have paused to exchange a few pleasant words about the season or the weather, on this occasion he merely nodded and moved on, his pace quickening as though he had suddenly remembered an urgent appointment. Miss Rook received this truncated courtesy with the same composed demeanour she had displayed in the church, but to the observant eye there might have been detected the slightest stiffening of her posture, the smallest compression of her lips, before she too continued on her way. Mr. Nathaniel Cross, whose daily duties at the grocer's shop afforded him ample opportunity to observe the comings and goings of Marrowley's inhabitants, had become increasingly alert to these small performances of altered regard. He noted who now passed Miss Rook with the briefest of acknowledgments where formerly they had stopped to chat. He observed the careful manner in which certain ladies of the town contrived to be examining shop windows or engaged in absorbing conversations precisely at those moments when they might otherwise have been expected to greet her. Most significantly, he detected the pattern by which these modifications of behaviour seemed to radiate outward from a common source as ripples spread across a pond from a stone cast into its centre. The technique employed was one of remarkable subtlety. No harsh words were spoken, no accusations made, no direct discouragements offered. Instead, there occurred a gentle but unmistakable cooling of the social atmosphere surrounding Miss Rook, a diminution of warmth that was all the more effective for being conducted through the most polite of instruments. Those who participated in this cooling cross suspected might not even recognise themselves as participants. They were simply following the lead of those whose judgment they trusted, deferring to opinions they assumed must be grounded in knowledge they themselves did not possess. It was, Cross reflected with the bitter wisdom of experience, a perfect mechanism of exclusion. By operating through hints and implications rather than explicit statements, it protected those who wielded it from ever being called to account for their actions. How could one object to courtesy, even if that courtesy had been stripped of its warmth? How could one protest against greetings that were perfectly proper in form, even if hollow in substance? The machinery of social rejection, when operated by skilled hands, could accomplish its purpose while maintaining an unbroken surface of respectability. As the 27th of December drew toward its close, Marley presented to any casual observer the picture of a community at peace with itself, content in its traditions and secure in its hierarchies. Yet beneath this placid surface, currents of unease had begun to stir. Mrs. Whitcomb found herself troubled by questions she could not quite formulate. Mr. Price felt the uncomfortable weight of divided loyalties, and Miss Rooke, maintaining her dignity in the face of treatment she could not understand, went about her business with a quietness that was either admirable stoicism or the numbness that comes from repeated small wounds. Only Mr. Cross, watching from his position on the margins, saw the pattern forming with complete clarity. He recognised it because he had lived it, because he understood from personal experience how communities enforce their boundaries not through violence but through the withdrawal of fellowship. And as he closed the account books for the day and prepared to walk home through the darkening streets, he found himself wondering whether silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of complicity, and whether his own long habit of quiet observation had been wisdom or merely cowardice by another name. Chapter 4. The Shape of Polite Disapproval. There exists in every settled community a language more powerful than words, a system of communication conducted entirely through the subtle instruments of social gesture. A raised eyebrow may convey disapproval more effectively than the most eloquent sermon. A hesitation before extending an invitation may speak volumes about altered regard, and the careful avoidance of a particular subject in conversation may announce its importance more loudly than if it had been discussed openly. Marrowley, like all towns of its character, had perfected this language over generations, refining it to such a degree that its speakers could convey the most complex judgments while maintaining an unbroken surface of propriety and goodwill. In the days that followed Christmas, this language was deployed with increasing frequency in matters concerning Miss Pauline Rooke. Those who employed it might have been hard-pressed to explain precisely what offence she was supposed to have committed, for the simple reason that no specific charge had ever been articulated. Instead, there circulated through the town a vague sense of impropriety, a feeling that something had occurred which made Miss Rooke's inclusion in certain social contexts no longer quite appropriate. The very haziness of this sentiment made it more rather than less effective, for what cannot be clearly stated cannot easily be refuted. Mrs. Delamere, calling upon Mrs. Wickham on the afternoon of the 29th, provided an inadvertent illustration of how this mechanism operated. The two ladies had been friends for many years, their connection dating back to girlhood, and their conversations possessed that quality of frank exchange which long intimacy permits. Yet when Mrs. Whitcomb mentioned, with studied casualness, that she had been considering commissioning a new gown from Miss Rooke for the spring season, Mrs. Delamere's response was immediate and telling. "Oh, my dear Eleanor," she said, her voice dropping to that confidential register reserved for the imparting of delicate information. "I'm certain Miss Rooke does very fine work, very fine indeed. No one could question her skill with a needle, but you know one must consider not merely the quality of the work itself, but the associations that attend it. There are standards to be maintained, appearances to consider." "What appearances?" Mrs. Wickham inquired, her tone gentle but probing. "Has Miss Rooke done something to compromise her character?" Mrs. Delamere shifted in her seat, her teacup suddenly requiring her complete attention. "Nothing specific that I could name," she admitted, after a moment's pause. "But you know how these things are, Eleanor. Where there's smoke, as they say. Mr. Harrowell himself mentioned to my husband that it might be wise to exercise a degree of caution in certain associations. He didn't elaborate, being far too considerate to spread gossip, but the implication was clear enough." Here then was the pattern laid bare. Mr. Harrowell had not accused Miss Rooke of any particular wrongdoing. He had merely suggested, in that carefully measured manner of his, that caution might be prudent. Those who received this suggestion, trusting in his judgment and wishing to avoid any potential embarrassment, passed it along to others in similarly vague terms. The result was a spreading cloud of suspicion without any definable source, a judgment without evidence, a condemnation that derived its power precisely from its refusal to specify grounds. Mrs. Whitcomb, listening to her friend's explanation, felt a stirring of unease that she could not entirely suppress. She had known Miss Rooke for several years and had always found her to be a woman of exemplary conduct, modest in manner and diligent in her work. The suggestion that she had somehow fallen short of proper standards seemed incongruous with everything Mrs. Whitcomb had observed. Yet she also understood the powerful current of social opinion in Marrowley, and how difficult it could be to swim against it without risking one's own standing. "I see," she said finally, though in truth she did not see at all, or rather saw too clearly the outlines of an injustice being perpetrated through the most respectable of means. Meanwhile, in the quieter corners of the town, Miss Rooke herself maintained her daily routines with a composure that was either admirable or heartbreaking depending upon one's perspective. She accepted commissions from those who still sought her services, executed them with her customary precision, and conducted herself in all public encounters with a dignity that refused to acknowledge the altered temperature of her reception. If she felt wounded by the change in her circumstances, she gave no outward sign of it. If she wondered what offence she had committed to warrant such treatment, she made no public inquiry. This restraint on her part served, paradoxically, to reinforce rather than challenge the vague disapproval that surrounded her. In Marrowley, as in many such communities, the absence of self-defence was often interpreted as tacit admission of guilt. A truly innocent person, the logic ran, would protest vigorously against unjust treatment. Miss Rooke's silence, her refusal to demand explanation or vindication, was taken by some as confirmation that she knew herself to be deserving of the censure she received. Mr. Cross, observing these developments with his characteristic clarity of vision, recognised in them the same cruel efficiency he had encountered in his own experience of social marginalisation. The machinery of exclusion, once set in motion, required little additional effort to maintain. It operated almost automatically, each person deferring to the judgment of others, each small withdrawal of warmth encouraging further withdrawals, until the cumulative effect achieved what no single act of unkindness could have accomplished, and, throughout it all, the fiction of blamelessness was preserved. No one had been cruel, everyone had merely been prudent, careful, properly concerned with maintaining appropriate standards. What those standards were, and how Miss Rooke had failed to meet them, remained questions without clear answers. But in the absence of clarity, assumption flourished, and assumption, once it had taken root in the fertile soil of social anxiety, proved remarkably resistant to the inconvenient intrusions of fact. Chapter 5. When Appearances Begin to Waver. The final days of December possess a peculiar quality of suspension, as though time itself hesitates before committing to the finality of a new year. In Marrowley, this interval was marked by an increase in social activity, as those families who had spent Christmas in quiet domesticity now ventured forth to fulfil their obligations of seasonal visiting, while those who had been energetically social during the festival itself retreated somewhat to recover their composure. It was during this period of transition that certain fissures in the town's apparent unanimity regarding Miss Rooke began to make themselves visible, though in ways that complicated rather than clarified the situation. Mr. Leonard Price found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The dinner at Mr. Harrowell's house had proceeded exactly as he had hoped, with conversation touching upon topics of professional advancement and the importance of sound judgment in all matters, particularly those of a social nature. Harrowell had been the very model of avuncular wisdom, offering guidance couched in such reasonable terms that to question it would have seemed churlish. Yet in the days that followed, Price discovered that the adoption of Harrowell's perspective carried consequences he had not fully anticipated. Walking through the town on the morning of the 30th, Price encountered Mr. Cross near the post office. The two men were not intimate friends, but they had always maintained cordial relations, their paths crossing frequently enough that a certain familiarity had developed between them. On this occasion, however, when Price made some casual remark about the fine weather and the approach of the new year, Cross's response was noticeably cooler than customary. "Indeed," said Cross, his tone perfectly polite yet somehow conveying a distance that had not previously existed between them. "One can only hope that the new year brings with it a renewal of conscience as well as calendar." The comment, delivered with Cross's characteristic quietness, left Price uncertain whether he had been offered a general philosophical observation or a specific criticism. He attempted to continue the conversation, but Cross excused himself with impeccable courtesy and moved on, leaving Price with the uncomfortable sensation of having been judged and found wanting, though for what specific offence he could not precisely determine. This encounter troubled Price more than he cared to admit. He was a young man whose calculations of advantage had always been tempered by a genuine desire to be thought well of, not merely by those who could advance his prospects, but by all whose good opinion seemed worth having. The realization that in securing Harrowell's approval he might have forfeited the respect of others created a conflict that his ambitious nature had not prepared him to resolve. Similar complications arose elsewhere. Mrs. Caroline Ashton, who had been among the first to adopt a cooler manner toward Miss Rooke, found herself questioned by her own daughter on the subject. The younger Mrs. Ashton, recently married and therefore perhaps less constrained by the elaborate social conventions that governed the behaviour of longer-established residents, had asked directly why her mother no longer employed Miss Rooke's services when her work had always been so satisfactory. "There are considerations beyond mere technical competence," Mrs. Ashton had replied, with that slight stiffness which indicates a position adopted more from deference to authority than personal conviction. "Mr. Harrowell suggested that it might be wise to be cautious in one's associations." "But cautious against what?" her daughter had pressed. "What has Miss Rooke actually done?" Mrs. Ashton found herself unable to provide a satisfactory answer to this reasonable question. She had accepted Harrowell's guidance because he was universally respected, because his judgment was considered sound, and because it had seemed easier to comply than to investigate. Now, confronted with her daughter's directness, she experienced a flutter of doubt, a small but persistent questioning of whether ease and wisdom were necessarily synonymous. Even Mr. Harrowell himself, though he maintained his customary appearance of benevolent authority, showed subtle signs of strain. At a meeting of the church committee on the afternoon of the 31st, he spoke with perhaps slightly more emphasis than necessary about the importance of maintaining proper standards, of protecting the community's moral character, of ensuring that charity did not become indistinguishable from approval of questionable conduct. His words were received with respectful attention, yet Mrs. Whitcomb, who had known him for many years, detected in his manner something she had rarely observed before, a defensiveness, as though he anticipated challenge even where none had been offered. The effect of these various complications was to create an atmosphere of uncertainty where previously there had been, if not clarity, at least the appearance of consensus. Some members of the community, like Price, found themselves questioning whether their adoption of Harrowell's position had been wise. Others, like Mrs. Ashton, discovered that actions taken in deference to respected authority became more difficult to justify when examined in the light of direct inquiry. And a few, like Cross, withdrew what small warmth they had previously shown toward those who participated in Miss Rooke's exclusion, creating a secondary network of social coolness that mirrored in miniature the larger pattern it was meant to protest. Yet through all these wavering appearances and shifting allegiances, one figure remained constant. Miss Rooke continued her work with the same quiet competence she had always displayed, accepting the alterations in her circumstances with a dignity that neither sought sympathy nor invited further injury. She had become, in a sense, the still centre around which the town's anxieties revolved, the fixed point against which all these uncertainties measured themselves. The old year was drawing to its close, and with it, the simple certainties that had governed Maryley's social life were beginning, however tentatively, to crack. What had seemed a straightforward matter of maintaining proper standards now appeared less clear, less comfortable, less easily reconciled with the season's professed spirit of goodwill. And in the growing discomfort of this recognition lay the first intimations that appearances, however carefully maintained, could not indefinitely substitute for truth. Chapter 6. Respectability under quiet strain. The first day of the new year arrived with that mixture of hope and trepidation which commonly attends such transitions. In Marrow-Lee, the observance took its customary form, church bells marking the passage from old to new, modest celebrations in those households inclined toward festivity, and a general air of resolution that rarely survived beyond the second week of January. Yet on this particular New Year's Day, the usual spirit of renewal was shadowed by an unease that had been accumulating throughout the Christmas season. An unease that now pressed with increasing insistence upon the consciences of several of the town's more thoughtful inhabitants. Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb had passed a restless night, her sleep troubled by reflections that would not be dismissed despite her best efforts to occupy her mind with more cheerful subjects. She had lived long enough to recognise the difference between the discomfort of inconvenience and the deeper disturbance of moral unease, and what she experienced now belonged decidedly to the latter category. The matter of Miss Rook's altered circumstances had begun to occupy her thoughts with a persistence that could not be attributed to idle curiosity or excessive sentiment. On the morning of the 1st, she resolved to act upon these troubling reflections. After attending the New Year service at St. Bartholomew's, she made her way to Miller's Lane, where Miss Rook resided. It was not a journey she undertook lightly, for she understood that in Marrow-Lee, as in all such communities, the act of visiting carried significance beyond the mere exchange of pleasantries. To call upon someone who had fallen under the shadow of general disapproval was to make a statement, however unintended, about one's own position regarding that disapproval. Miss Rook received her visitor with the same composed courtesy she displayed in all her interactions, showing no surprise at the call, though such visits from ladies of Mrs. Whitcomb's standing were not customary occurrences in her modest parlour. Tea was prepared and served with quiet efficiency, and the two women sat facing one another across a small table covered with a cloth of Miss Rook's own making, its stitching so fine as to be nearly invisible. "I hope you will forgive the liberty of this call," Mrs. Whitcomb began, her voice gentle but steady. "I have been troubled of late by certain observations, and I find that I cannot in good conscience allow the new year to commence without seeking some understanding of matters that have puzzled me." Miss Rook's hands, which had been occupied with the pouring of tea, stilled for the briefest moment before resuming their task. "You are very kind to concern yourself, Mrs. Whitcomb. I am not certain I can provide the understanding you seek, as I confess myself equally puzzled by recent developments." "Then you have noticed the change in your reception?" "One would need to be remarkably insensible not to notice," Miss Rook replied, a faint trace of something that might have been humour touching her otherwise serious expression, "though I confess myself entirely at a loss to explain it. I have searched my memory most thoroughly for any offence I might have given, any impropriety I might have committed, but I can discover nothing that would warrant such a marked alteration in the regard of my neighbours." Mrs. Whitcomb felt a tightening in her chest, that physical manifestation of sympathetic distress which accompanies the recognition of another's undeserved suffering. "And yet you have borne this treatment with remarkable composure. What alternative presents itself?" Miss Rook asked, her tone remaining level despite the weight of the question. "To protest against accusations that are never made explicit, to defend oneself against charges that remain unspoken. I have my work, Mrs. Whitcomb, and my self-respect. These, I have determined, must be sufficient." The dignity of this response affected Mrs. Whitcomb profoundly. She saw before her not a woman crushed by social rejection, but one who had discovered in adversity a strength that required no external validation. It was a revelation that threw into sharp relief the relative shallowness of the concerns that typically occupied Marrow-Lee society, the petty anxieties about position and appearance that seemed, when measured against Miss Rook's quiet courage, to be unworthy of serious consideration. "You shame us," Mrs. Whitcomb said softly, "those of us who have remained silent when silence becomes complicity." Miss Rook shook her head slightly. "I do not seek to shame anyone, nor do I claim any particular virtue in my response to circumstances I cannot control. I merely proceed as I must, with what resources I possess." The conversation continued for some minutes longer, touching upon topics of no great consequence, yet charged with an unspoken understanding that had been established between the two women. When Mrs. Whitcomb finally took her leave, she did so with a determination that had not been present when she arrived. The cost of maintaining respectability, she'd come to understand, could sometimes exceed its value. There were circumstances in which kindness required not merely good intentions, but active courage, a willingness to place fairness above comfort and truth, above the convenient fictions that sustained social harmony. As she walked back through the town, Mrs. Whitcomb passed Mr. Nathaniel Cross, who was taking his customary afternoon walk. They exchanged greetings, and something in Mrs. Whitcomb's expression prompted Cross to speak with unusual directness. "You have been to see Miss Rook," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of observed fact. "I have," Mrs. Whitcomb replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And I find myself wondering, Mr. Cross, whether you might assist me in understanding how such a situation has come to pass." Cross considered for a moment before responding. "I am not privy to the counsels of those who guide opinion in Marrowley, Mrs. Whitcomb. But I have observed over many years how exclusion operates. It requires no conspiracy, no malicious intent, merely a whispered suggestion from someone whose judgment is trusted, and the natural human tendency to defer to that judgment rather than investigate its foundation. And once set in motion, such a process acquires its own momentum. Precisely. Each person assumes that others possess knowledge they themselves lack. No one wishes to appear foolish by questioning what seems to be accepted wisdom, and so the excluded party finds themselves confronting not individual cruelties, but a collective turning away that no single person feels responsible for initiating or maintaining. Mrs. Whitcomb nodded slowly, her understanding deepening. The mechanism Cross described was one she recognised, though she had never before seen it articulated with such clarity. It was a mechanism that protected its participants from accountability, even as it inflicted real harm, that operated through the most respectable of instruments while achieving thoroughly disreputable ends. The strain that respectability placed upon conscience was becoming increasingly apparent, not merely to Mrs. Whitcomb and Mr. Cross, but to others throughout Marrowley who found themselves uncomfortably caught between the desire to maintain social standing and the growing recognition that maintaining such standing had required them to participate, however passively, in an injustice they could neither fully understand nor adequately justify. Chapter 7. The Long Memory of Small Cruelties. There is a peculiar burden that attaches itself to memory, for while pleasant recollections may fade with the passing years, the smaller wounds inflicted by unkindness possess a remarkable persistence. They return unbidden, often at moments when the mind seeks rest, presenting themselves with a clarity that newer experiences cannot match. Miss Pauline Rook, lying wakeful in her narrow bed on the night following Mrs. Whitcomb's unexpected visit, found herself revisiting scenes from years past that she had thought long since relegated to the dim storage of forgotten things. She remembered, with surprising distinctness, an occasion some 3 years previous when she had been engaged to alter a gown for Mrs. Delamere. The work had been completed to perfection, the fit impeccable, yet when Miss Rook had delivered the finished garment, she had been kept waiting in the servants' hall for nearly an hour while Mrs. Delamere attended to other matters. No apology had been offered for this delay, no acknowledgement made that Miss Rook's time might possess value equal to that of more prosperous persons. It had been a small discourtesy, easily overlooked, yet the memory of standing in that dim hallway, listening to the sounds of comfortable conversation from the rooms beyond, carried a sting that the passage of time had not entirely dulled. There had been other moments, each insignificant in itself, yet accumulating over years into a pattern she had trained herself not to examine too closely. The invitations that had been extended to other seamstresses, but not to her, the conversations that had ceased upon her approach, resuming only after she had passed beyond earshot. The the studied politeness that maintained all proper forms while withholding any genuine warmth. She had accepted these small exclusions as the natural consequence of her position, the inevitable price of existing on the margins of respectable society without the protection of family connections or independent means. What troubled her now, lying in the darkness and examining these memories with new eyes, was not that such treatment had occurred, but rather that she had so readily accepted it as her due. She had accommodated herself to diminishment, had learned to expect little and to express gratitude for small mercies, had become complicit in her own marginalisation through the very quietness that others praised as becoming modesty. Mr. Leonard Price, too, found himself troubled by unwelcome recollections. He remembered with uncomfortable clarity the ease with which he had adopted Mr. Harrowell's suggestions regarding Miss Rooke, the speed with which he had altered his behaviour toward her, without pausing to question the foundation of his actions. It was not the first time he had deferred to the judgment of those he considered his social superiors, allowing their opinions to supplant his own observations and experience. He thought of his father, a country shopkeeper who had laboured to provide his son with opportunities for advancement, who had spoken often of the importance of maintaining one's integrity, even in the face of pressure to conform. Price had always assumed he understood these paternal counsels, yet now he wondered whether he had ever truly tested that understanding. It was easy enough to claim integrity when no real sacrifice was required, when principle and advantage pointed in the same direction. The measure of character, his father had said, revealed itself in those moments when doing right carried a cost. Sitting in his modest lodgings, Price recognised with painful clarity that he had failed that measure. He had sacrificed fairness to ambition, had valued Harrowell's approval above his own conscience, had participated in Miss Rooke's exclusion not because he believed her deserving of such treatment, but because he feared the consequences of standing apart from the prevailing sentiment. The recognition brought with it a shame that was all the more acute for being belated. Even among those who had not directly participated in Miss Rooke's exclusion, uncomfortable recollections stirred. Mrs. Agnes Porter, reflecting upon her guarded conversation with Mrs. Whitcomb, remembered occasions when she herself had been the object of subtle condescension, moments when her reduced circumstances had been acknowledged through calculated kindness that somehow emphasised rather than diminished the distance between herself and those more fortunately situated. She had survived these experiences through a combination of dignity and acceptance, much as Miss Rooke was doing now, yet she recognised with discomfort that surviving injustice was not the same as opposing it. The realisation that troubled Mrs. Porter most acutely was how easily she had withheld from another the very solidarity she might have wished to receive herself. When Mrs. Whitcomb had inquired about Miss Rooke's absence from Mrs. Delamere's gathering, Porter had deflected rather than enlightened, had chosen the safety of evasion over the risk of honest engagement. In doing so, she had perpetuated the very mechanism of exclusion that had, at various points in her own life, caused her pain. Mr. Cross, whose observations had always been characterised by clear-eyed recognition of social patterns, found in these days of early January a vindication that brought no satisfaction. He had understood from the beginning how the machinery of exclusion operated, had recognised the signatures of coordinated coolness and manufactured consensus. What he had not fully appreciated until now was the toll such understanding took upon the spirit when it remained trapped in observation without action. For years, Cross had witnessed similar patterns play out against others who occupied Marilighi's margins. He had seen reputations unmade through whispered suggestions, livelihoods threatened by the withdrawal of custom, individuals rendered invisible through collective agreement not to acknowledge their presence, and in each instance he had observed silently, had noted the injustice with careful mental accounting, but had never once stepped forward to challenge it. His passivity, he now understood, had been rationalised through appeals to practicality and self-preservation. What could one bookkeeper accomplish against the settled opinion of Marrowleigh's respectable classes? To speak out would be to invite upon himself the same treatment being visited upon the object of his defence. Better surely to maintain his position of quiet observation, to harbour private disagreement while offering no public challenge. Yet these rationalisations, which had once seemed adequate, now appeared in a less flattering light. The long memory of small cruelties extended not merely to those inflicted upon oneself, or observed being inflicted upon others, but also to those one had failed to prevent through one's own silence. The accumulated weight of these uncontested injustices pressed upon Cross's conscience with increasing insistence, suggesting that observation without action was itself a form of participation, that neutrality in the face of wrong became by default a kind of complicity. The 2nd of January found Marrowley superficially unchanged, its streets and buildings arranged in their familiar configurations, its inhabitants pursuing their customary routines. Yet beneath this placid surface, the accumulation of uncomfortable recollections was beginning to effect a subtle transformation. Memories that had been suppressed or rationalized were demanding reconsideration. Actions that had seemed justified by appeals to propriety or prudence were revealing themselves to be something rather less admirable. And the question that had seemed comfortably rhetorical, what harm could result from a few withdrawn invitations, a modest cooling of social warmth, was acquiring answers that made continued indifference increasingly difficult to maintain. Chapter 8. What kindness this had overlooked. The 3rd of January dawned grey and damp, the sort of morning that seems designed to encourage indoor reflection rather than outdoor activity. In Marrowley, the holiday season was drawing to its official close, with most households preparing to resume the ordinary rhythms of work and obligation after the festive interval. Yet the resumption of normalcy carried with it, for several of the town's inhabitants, a quality of dissonance, as though the familiar routines no longer fit quite as comfortably as they had before the Christmas season had introduced its subtle disturbances. Mrs. Whitcomb had spent considerable time in thought since her visit to Miss Rooke, and her reflections had led her to a reassessment not merely of the seamstress's situation, but of the broader patterns of behaviour that characterised Marrowley society. She had always considered herself a woman of charitable inclinations, one who took seriously her obligations toward those less fortunately placed. Yet she now recognised, with a clarity that brought considerable discomfort, that her charity had operated within carefully maintained boundaries, extending goodwill without ever questioning the structures that made such goodwill necessary. She had visited the sick and the poor, had contributed generously to worthy causes, had spoken kindly to those who served her, and treated her dependents with consideration. But these acts of benevolence, admirable though they might be, had never challenged the fundamental arrangements of Marrowley society, had never questioned who possessed the authority to define respectability or the right to withdraw it at will. Kindness, she understood now, could coexist quite comfortably with injustice, could even serve to obscure that injustice by creating the appearance of compassion while leaving its root causes undisturbed. The realization that troubled her most acutely concerned Mr. Stephen Harrowell. She had known him for many years, had always regarded him as a man of impeccable character, someone whose judgment could be trusted in matters both small and large. She had never before thought to question the source of his authority, to ask by what right he guided the opinions of others or shaped the social landscape of the town. His influence had seemed so natural, so obviously the product of superior wisdom and experience, that to examine it critically would have appeared churlish. Yet now, considering his role in Miss Rooke's exclusion, Mrs. Whitcomb found herself compelled to reconsider assumptions she had long held without conscious examination. Harrowell's suggestions regarding Miss Rooke had been delivered with his characteristic blend of concern and discretion, presented as though he acted only from the highest motives of protecting the community from some unnamed impropriety. But what precisely was this impropriety? And who had granted Harrowell the authority to judge it? The more Mrs. Whitcomb reflected upon these questions, the more she recognised that Harrowell's power rested not upon any official position or demonstrable expertise, but rather upon the willingness of others to defer to his judgment without demanding justification. He had created, perhaps without fully intending to do so, a system in which his preferences became community standards, his discomforts translated into social boundaries, and his desire to avoid awkwardness took precedence over considerations of fairness or truth. This recognition did not lead Mrs. Whitcomb to conclude that Harrowell was malicious. Indeed, she suspected he genuinely believed himself to be acting in Marrowlee's best interests, protecting its moral character and maintaining proper standards of conduct. But she understood now that good intentions could not excuse harmful outcomes, that the desire to preserve harmony could become an instrument of oppression when it prioritized comfort over justice. Mr. Price, wrestling with his own moral reckoning, arrived at similar conclusions through a different path. He had begun to see Harrowell not as the benevolent guide he had previously imagined, but as a figure whose investment in maintaining social control derived from deeper needs than mere civic responsibility. There was something in Harrowell's careful management of opinion, his subtle direction of sentiment, his evident discomfort when questioned, that suggested a man who required the deference of others to validate his own sense of importance. The dinner at Harrowell's house, which Price had attended with such eager anticipation, now appeared in memory less as an honour bestowed than as a demonstration of influence exercised. Harrowell had not merely offered guidance. He had tested Price's willingness to comply with suggestions that carried no explicit justification, to accept authority without demanding accountability. And Price, eager for advancement and fearful of appearing presumptuous, had passed that test in a manner that now filled him with regret. What struck Price most forcefully was the contrast between Harrowell's carefully cultivated image of benevolence and the actual effects of his actions. Harrowell spoke often of community standards and proper conduct, yet his enforcement of these standards fell most heavily upon those least able to defend themselves. He presented his guidance as concern for others' welfare, yet seemed remarkably unconcerned with the welfare of those he encouraged others to exclude. His power derived from his ability to make cruelty appear respectable, to dress injustice in the garments of social propriety. Meanwhile, Miss Rook's dignity had become increasingly visible to those willing to see it. Her refusal to protest, which had initially been interpreted by some as tacit admission of guilt, now appeared in its true light, not as weakness or complicity, but as a strength that required no external validation. She had maintained her self-respect in circumstances designed to erode it, had preserved her integrity when surrender would have been easier, had demonstrated through quiet example that one's worth need not depend upon the approval of others. Mrs. Whitcomb, encountering Miss Rook in the marketplace on the afternoon of the 3rd, was struck anew by this quality. The seamstress moved through the town with neither defiance nor defeat, simply proceeding about her business with the same composed efficiency she had always displayed. There was no bitterness in her bearing, no apparent resentment toward those who had withdrawn their warmth. She simply persisted, quietly refusing to accept diminishment as her permanent condition. "Miss Rook," Mrs. Whitcomb said, approaching her with a decisiveness that surprised them both, "I wonder if you might do me the honour of taking tea at my house tomorrow afternoon. There are matters I should like to discuss, if you would be so kind as to spare the time." The invitation, extended publicly and without qualification, represented a choice. Mrs. Whitcomb understood that in Marrowlee such gestures carried weight, that to show Miss Rook this degree of respect was to make a statement about where one stood regarding her treatment. Yet she made the invitation without hesitation, having concluded that kindness which operated only within safe boundaries was not truly kindness at all. Miss Rook's eyes widened slightly, her composure wavering for just a moment before reasserting itself. "You're very gracious, Mrs. Whitcomb. I should be honoured to accept." As the two women parted, others in the marketplace who had witnessed this exchange felt the subtle shift it represented. What had seemed a settled matter, a consensus achieved and unlikely to be challenged, now appeared less certain. If Mrs. Whitcomb, whose standing in Marrowlee was unquestionable, chose to extend such courtesy to Miss Rook, then perhaps the assumptions that had guided others' behaviour deserved reconsideration. The first crack in the facade of unanimity had appeared, and through it, the possibility of change had begun, however tentatively, to emerge. Chapter 9. A Conscience Stirred on Christmas Child night. The evening of the 4th of January found Mr. Stephen Harrowell in an uncharacteristic state of agitation. He sat in his study, ostensibly reviewing correspondence, but the letters before him remained unread, his attention wandering despite his efforts to maintain focus. The room, usually a sanctuary of ordered thought and comfortable reflection, seemed on this particular evening to offer no peace, its familiar furnishings appearing somehow accusatory in the lamplight. The cause of his disquiet was not difficult to identify, though he had spent the better part of 2 days attempting to dismiss it as inconsequential. He had learned through the efficient channels by which information travelled in Marrowley of Mrs. Whitcomb's public invitation to Miss Rooke, and the knowledge had affected him more profoundly than he cared to admit. Mrs. Whitcomb's standing in the community was such that her actions carried weight, and her evident willingness to question the prevailing sentiment regarding Miss Rooke suggested a challenge to the very authority Harrowell had long exercised without conscious acknowledgement. What troubled him most acutely, however, was not the threat to his influence, but rather the growing insistence of certain reflections he had been attempting to suppress. In the privacy of his study, with no audience to perform for and no expectations to maintain, Harrowell found himself confronting questions he had successfully avoided in more public settings. What precisely had Miss Rooke done to warrant her exclusion? What specific offence justified the treatment she had received? The honest answer, when he finally permitted himself to acknowledge it, was both simple and damning. Nothing of substance. There had been no scandal, no impropriety, no breach of conduct that would have survived scrutiny if subjected to clear examination. Instead, there had been merely a minor social awkwardness from several years past, an incident so trivial that Harrowell himself could barely recall its details with precision. Miss Rooke had attended, as a working seamstress, a charitable function at which her presence had created a momentary uncertainty about proper arrangements. Should she be seated with the ladies she served, or with those who served the ladies? The question had been resolved, as such questions usually were, through a compromise that satisfied no one entirely, but the incident had lingered in Harrowell's memory, not because of any fault on Miss Rooke's part, but because it had reminded him of the subtle complexities of maintaining social order, the delicate negotiations required to preserve hierarchies that depended upon everyone understanding and accepting their place. In the weeks and months that followed, Harrowell had found himself subtly discouraging Miss Rooke's inclusion in situations where similar awkwardness might arise. His guidance had been gentle, his suggestions tactful, always framed as concern for avoiding embarrassment rather than as judgment of the seamstress herself. And because his judgment was trusted, because his authority derived from years of careful cultivation, others had deferred to his implied preferences without demanding explanation. What had begun as a desire to prevent minor discomfort had gradually hardened into something approaching policy, a settled understanding that Miss Rooke, while respectable in her work, was not quite suited for fuller social participation. Harrowell had never articulated this understanding explicitly, had never intended to cause the woman harm. He had simply guided opinion in ways that made his own life, and by extension the life of Marrowley society, run more smoothly. But smoothness, he now recognised with growing unease, had been purchased at a cost he had been unwilling to calculate. His desire to avoid awkwardness had resulted in Miss Rooke's systematic exclusion from opportunities for fellowship and connection. His preference for order had been elevated above considerations of fairness, and his informal authority, which he had always believed himself to exercise benevolently, had been deployed to protect his own comfort, rather than to serve any genuine principle. The realization brought with it a sensation Harrowell had rarely experienced: shame. Not the mild embarrassment of a social misstep, but the deeper discomfort that accompanies the recognition of moral failure. He had prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who guided others wisely and acted always from proper motives. Yet when examined honestly, his actions regarding Miss Rooke revealed something far less admirable: a willingness to sacrifice another's dignity to preserve his own ease, a readiness to wield influence without accepting accountability for its consequences. He rose from his desk and moved to the window, looking out over the darkened square. The town appeared peaceful, its inhabitants safely enclosed in their various dwellings, secure in the routines and assumptions that governed their lives. But Harrowell understood now that this apparent peace had been maintained, partly through the exclusion of questions that might have disturbed it, through the suppression of challenges that might have required uncomfortable self-examination. The decision formed itself slowly in his mind, not as a sudden conversion, but as the gradual acknowledgement of what conscience had been insisting upon for days. He could not undo the harm that had been done, could not retrieve the invitations that had been withheld or restore the warmth that had been withdrawn. But he could, at minimum, acknowledge his role in creating the situation, could admit to himself and to others that his guidance had been flawed, his judgment clouded by considerations that had nothing to do with Miss Rook's actual character or conduct. The following afternoon, Harrowell called upon Mrs. Whitcomb. He found her in her parlour, and something in his manner must have communicated the seriousness of his purpose, for she dismissed her maid and invited him to speak freely. What followed was not a dramatic confession, but a quiet, carefully worded admission of error, delivered without self-pity or attempts at justification. "I have been reflecting," Harrowell began, his voice steady but lacking its usual authority, "upon the situation concerning Miss Rook, and I find I must acknowledge that my counsel to others regarding her has been misguided. There was no impropriety on her part that justified the treatment she has received. I allowed a minor social awkwardness to influence my judgment in ways that have caused genuine harm." Mrs. Whitcomb listened in silence, her expression revealing neither condemnation nor absolution, simply patient attention. When Harrowell finished speaking, she regarded him for a long moment before responding. "I am grateful for your honesty, Mr. Harrowell," she said at last. "It requires courage to acknowledge error, particularly when one has been accustomed to having one's judgment trusted without question. But the acknowledgement, while valuable, does not in itself repair the damage. The question now is what ought to be done to address it." Harrowell nodded, accepting the implicit challenge in her words. "I intend to make clear, in whatever manner seems appropriate, that my previous guidance was in error. I cannot compel others to alter their behaviour, but I can at least remove the influence that has encouraged their coolness towards Miss Rook." "That would be a beginning," Mrs. Whitcomb replied, her tone neither warm nor cold, simply measured. "Though I suspect you will find, as I have found, that repairing what has been damaged is considerably more difficult than causing the damage in the first instance." The conversation continued for some minutes longer, touching upon the practical matters of how best to address the situation without causing further awkwardness or drawing excessive attention to Miss Rook's circumstances. When Harrowell finally took his leave, he did so with the curious sensation of having surrendered a burden he had not fully recognised he was carrying, even as he assumed a new responsibility that would require sustained effort rather than momentary resolution. The conscience that had been stirred on this January evening would not easily settle back into comfortable sleep. But in its wakefulness lay the possibility, however tentative, of genuine amendment rather than mere regret. Chapter 10. A Town Slightly Changed. The winter morning that brought the 6th of January to Marrowley arrived with a quality of light that seemed particularly suited to fresh beginnings. The frost that had settled during the night created patterns of remarkable delicacy upon every surface, transforming the familiar landscape into something both recognisable and subtly renewed. Those who emerged from their dwellings to attend to the day's business moved through streets that appeared unchanged in their essential character, yet somehow different in ways that defied immediate articulation. Miss Pauline Rook, making her way to the draper's shop to collect some materials required for her work, noticed the alteration first in small gestures. Mrs. Porter, encountering her near the church square, did not merely nod in passing, but stopped to exchange genuine pleasantries about the weather and the quality of the light. The greeting was neither elaborate nor apologetic, but it carried a warmth that had been absent in recent weeks, a return to the ordinary courtesy that predated the season's disturbance. At the draper's establishment, Mr. Jameson himself attended to her requirements with his customary efficiency, but added to this a small comment about the fineness of her recent work, having heard praise of a gown she had completed for one of his customers. The remark was casual, requiring no response beyond polite acknowledgement, yet it represented a recognition that extended beyond mere commercial transaction, an affirmation of her skill and standing that would have been withheld only days earlier. These alterations, modest though they were, accumulated throughout the morning into something approaching restoration. Not a dramatic reversal, not a public ceremony of apology or vindication, but rather a quiet return to conditions that should never have been disturbed. Miss Rook received these changes with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout the period of her exclusion, neither demanding more elaborate amends, nor expressing obvious relief at their cessation. Mr. Leonard Price, observing some of these interactions from a distance, felt both gratitude and regret. He had made his own small contribution to the restoration, greeting Miss Rook with genuine warmth when their paths crossed the previous day, and finding in her gracious response neither reproach nor awkwardness. Yet he understood that repairing damage was not equivalent to never having caused it, that some consequences of moral failure persisted even after the failure itself had been acknowledged and addressed. He had learned something valuable from the experience, though the education had come at a cost he would have preferred not to pay. Ambition, he now understood, required direction from principle rather than mere calculation of advantage. The approval of those in authority deserved respect, but not deference so complete as to silence conscience, and the measure of one's character revealed itself not in moments of easy virtue, but in those uncomfortable instances when doing right required standing apart from prevailing sentiment. Mr. Harrowell, for his part, had kept his word to Mrs. Whitcomb. In conversations over the following days, he had made clear, without excessive drama or elaborate confession, that his previous guidance regarding Miss Rook had been mistaken. He had not attempted to compel others to alter their behaviour through the same informal authority he had previously employed to encourage their coolness. Instead, he had simply removed the weight of his opinion from the scale, allowing others to form their own judgments based on their own observations rather than deference to his supposed wisdom. The result was not a complete transformation of Marrowley society, not a fundamental restructuring of its hierarchies or assumptions. The town remained what it had always been, a community of ordinary people navigating the complicated terrain of social obligation and personal conscience with varying degrees of success. But something had shifted nonetheless, some small adjustment in the balance between comfort and justice, between the preservation of appearances and the acknowledgement of truth. Mrs. Whitcomb, taking tea with Miss Rook in her parlour on the afternoon of the 6th, found in their conversation a quality of genuine fellowship that transcended the boundaries of social station. They spoke of ordinary matters, the approach of spring, the challenges of particular types of needlework, the small satisfactions of work well done. Yet beneath these ordinary topics lay an understanding that had been forged through the events of the past weeks, a recognition that dignity and worth derived not from social position, but from qualities of character that could manifest themselves in any station of life. "I am grateful," Miss Rook said quietly, "for your kindness during a difficult period. You acted when others remained silent, and that required courage I shall not forget." Mrs. Whitcomb shook her head gently. "I acted far later than I ought to have done, and with less resolution than the situation demanded. If there is any lesson I have learned from these events, it is that kindness which waits for perfect safety is scarcely kindness at all." Mr. Nathaniel Cross, who had observed the unfolding of these events with his characteristic clarity of vision, found in their resolution a measure of qualified hope. The machinery of exclusion that had operated against Miss Rook had been disrupted, but it had not been dismantled. It remained available for future deployment, requiring only the proper circumstances and the acquiescence of those who preferred comfort to the more difficult work of maintaining fairness. Yet something had been demonstrated nonetheless, that such machinery was not inevitable, that its operation depended upon the complicity of individuals who possessed the capacity to choose differently and that when conscience finally asserted itself against the pressure to conform, change became possible even in communities as settled and self-satisfied as Marrowley. The town resumed its ordinary routines as January advanced, the holiday season receding into memory and the new year establishing its own rhythm of work and obligation. To the casual observer, nothing of consequence had occurred. There had been no scandal, no dramatic confrontation, no event sufficiently remarkable to merit mention beyond the immediate circle of those involved. Yet for those who had participated in the events of that Christmas season, whether as perpetrators of injustice or witnesses to it, something subtle but significant had altered. They had learned or relearned truths that any person of conscience ought to have known without such instruction, that judgment without foundation is cruelty regardless of how politely it is expressed, that silence in the face of wrong becomes a form of participation, and that the courage to place fairness above comfort is a quality requiring constant cultivation rather than a virtue one possesses once and for all. Marrowley was not transformed. Its hierarchies remained largely intact, its assumptions about propriety and position mostly undisturbed. But it was, in the manner suggested by this chapter's heading, slightly changed. Not perfected, not revolutionized, but altered in ways that might, with continued effort and sustained attention, lead to further improvements in how its inhabitants treated one another and understood their obligations to justice and kindness. The Christmas Eve that had introduced these disturbances now stood in memory as a marker, a point of reference against which future actions might be measured. It served as a reminder that the season's professed spirit of goodwill required more than sentiment and tradition, that it demanded instead the difficult work of examining one's own behaviour and accepting responsibility for its consequences. And so the story concludes not with triumph, but with modest hope, not with perfect resolution, but with the recognition that moral progress occurs not through single dramatic conversions, but through the accumulated effect of small choices made daily by ordinary people striving, however imperfectly, to align their actions with their professed values. Marrowley remained Marrowley as people remained themselves, but the possibility of something better had been demonstrated, and in that demonstration lay the seed of whatever further improvements the future might bring. May we all, in our own communities and circumstances, possess the humility to recognise our failures, the courage to acknowledge them honestly, and the persistence to make whatever amends our imperfect human nature permits. And may the story of a small English town during one Christmas season serve as a gentle reminder that the greatest mysteries often concern not the solving of complex puzzles, but rather the simpler yet more challenging question of how we ought to treat one another with the dignity and fairness that every human soul deserves.